Hello and welcome to Sick Notes. My name's Ed Hope, a junior doctor in the UK, and on this channel we talk about everything to do with medicine and try and explain it in simple terms. So if that sounds good, then why not subscribe to the channel? Now, I don't know if you guys remember this classic film from the 1980s, a Spielberg classic called INNERSPACE. I remember it as a kid. It's all about a kind of science experiment that goes wrong, trying to shrink down Lieutenant Tuck Pendelton, and he ends up inside another human being, this character called Jack. So we get to see some interesting view of the human body from the inside. So I thought I'd try and revisit this and explain some of the things that's going on. Just like Lieutenant Tuck, let's dive into it.
I look at the total at the register, and it's way up over, and it's way up over $100,000.
So we see Jack's doctor here examining him by percussing the chest, and we do this to hear the resonance of the note that we're tapping to give us an idea of the density of the tissue beneath it. Normal lung tissue should be resonant, so if it's hyper-resonant, we may have air between the lung and the chest wall, a so-called pneumothorax. And if the note we hear is very dull, it could be an increased density of the tissue beneath it. So it could be a mass or fluid or consolidation that comes along with infection.
You know that I'm more than your doctor. I'm your friend. You're one of my favorite patients. I mean, let's face it, your regular office visits are the cornerstone of my entire medical practice.
So there's a strong implication here that Jack's symptoms are psychosomatic, and the doctor's probably benefiting financially from Jack's health anxiety, what we call being a hypochondriac. Clearly, this is a bit of satire. I see lots of people with worries, but they tend to be around genuine health issues, or sometimes stemming from a lack of understanding of conditions, rather than them being completely fine and wanting loads of investigations like we see here. Although obviously this does happen, but I often think this is overrepresented in TV and films.
Oh, keep us between 8 and 11. I'm just getting too hot.
What was that bit all about? There we see Lieutenant Tuck showing how selfies used to be done in the 80s. So here we see Lieutenant Tuck Pendleton has become miniaturized and is now in this syringe here. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know that this type of thing just would not be possible. All the way from our kind of the cell biology up to our physiology, we're just designed to be the size we are given our environment. So just thinking about it really simply from a cell biology point of view, shrinking us down would involve us either reducing the size of our cells or reducing the number of cells, both of which would have problems. Each of our cells could sort of be reduced in size by a very small amount, perhaps reducing the amount of cytoplasm in there, because there's variation in all of us, but nowhere near close to this level. As we couldn't shrink the apparatus that makes the cells, this requires the building blocks of molecules and proteins. You know, that would be limited in size by the atoms that make them. So the other option is reducing the number of cells. I think this would end up in quite a big old mess. You know, just off the top of my head, reducing the number of brain cells by 1,000 times, you know, wouldn't make you very smart. So let's just assume somehow this is all possible. Your body is just not designed to be this miniature in our environment. For example, just your circulatory system, your heart and your lungs would be working overtime. You know, a mouse's heart rate is around 500 beats per minute, whereas our heart rate's around 60 to 100, so our muscle cells just would not be able to keep up with the pace. So there is a disruption to the experiment, and by accident, Lieutenant Tuck gets injected into our hypochondriac Jack. And finally, this scientist dude knows where he's injecting into. The butt and not the neck, which we always seem to see in these kind of sci-fi films. We generally want somewhere with muscle, but not a lot of nerves or blood vessels or other delicate structures that we can damage. So we often use the deltoid as well, the large muscle on the arm here. And the position this scientist uses is pretty much perfect. Let me show you. So I want you to imagine your big gluteal muscles here overlying your pelvic bone. And to site this injection, we'd divide this area up into 4, so up into quadrants. And we'd go for the upper outer quadrant. So this is where we should be injecting. This pretty much guarantees we're going to miss the big sciatic nerve, which is in the lower inner quadrant. Once we have injected into the area, we usually pull a little bit back on the syringe to make sure we aren't in a blood vessel. But he's clearly in a rush here because he's being chased by a guy that shoots bullets from his fingers. So he ain't got time for that. It's just going straight in. And he's, as I said, he's picked it a pretty much good place to put it.
What the hell are these things? Fat cells?
I think Tuck's pretty much bang on. So we see our first look inside the human body. And yeah, these kind of look fat cells to me. They're kind of quite globular, very pale. But I'd expect a little bit more connective tissue bringing them together. There's seems to be a lot of space, which I guess a lot of fluid there, but that could be the fluid from the actual injection. So we normally only put maybe 1 ml of fluid into injections, because if we put a lot in, it can actually stretch the tissue and make it quite painful. And there look to be way more than that in the actual syringe. So maybe this is explaining why there's, a little bit more fluid than we'd expect around fat tissue. And many of us will know there's plenty of fat tissue in your bottom too. So, that all kind of checks out.
Jack, get a hold of yourself, Jack.
I need some aspirin.
What?
Please, I'm begging you for some aspirin!
Jack's desperate for the aspirin. I'm not sure quite why. Maybe he's got some pain going on. Aspirin does have some analgesia, some pain relief effects. We actually don't tend to use it so much for that nowadays because there are better drugs available. Aspirin is still very much a mainstay of treatment for its antiplatelet properties. That is to prevent clots forming in heart disease or people at risk of strokes. But either way, you wouldn't be chugging down aspirin or probably any medication for that matter, the way Jack does it here.
Doesn't anything work?
Pathway to optic nerve is as follows. Superior gluteal vein to common iliac vein to inferior vena cava past right atrium to superior vena cava to right internal jugular vein to optic chiasma.
Let's drive.
Cool. That's a pretty bang-on accurate way to get to the optic chiasms. And funny enough, we used to play games like this at medical school, try and get from one part of the body to the other using, blood vessels, nerves or muscles and things like that. Pretty cool dudes. However, I probably wouldn't go that direction. Why? Because once you get to the superior vena cava, you'll be going against the flow of blood and kind of against gravity as well. The flow of the blood from the head into the right atrium. Therefore, I think you'd be far better kind of going round the circulatory system, so through the heart and through the lungs, and then back up through the arterial system into the head. Let's just assume there's some reason why they can't do this. Perhaps because if you travel the route I suggest, you could get stuck in the lung and cause a pulmonary embolism, like we know blood clots can do. It's a really nice look at the anatomy of the inferior vena cava here, the main blood vessel that drains the blood from the lower part of the body. So we see our renal veins here, the large veins that take the clean blood from the kidneys and put it back into the circulation. And because the inferior vena cava sits slightly on the right hand side, we can see here that the left gonadal vein actually goes into the left renal vein, which is completely correct. Yet on the right hand side, it goes directly into the inferior vena cava. So nice bit of detail here. The optic chiasm, which is where Lieutenant Tuck says he is aiming for, is the area where your two optic nerves, one from each eye, meet. And some of the nerve fibers actually cross to be interpreted by the different side of your brain. Chiasm actually means cross. And we can easily find out where the optic chiasm is in any skull. So I want you to get your skulls out. So if we open up our skulls, you'll see here a little indent here. that we call the pituitary fossa. So we can see the two holes where our two optic nerves would come through. And this is called the pituitary fossa. Fossa means hole because this is where your pituitary gland sits. And the optic chiasm is where your two optic nerves cross just above the pituitary gland. And we know this is where the optic chiasm is because if you get a pituitary gland tumour, an adenoma, so the pituitary gland grows, it can actually press the optic chiasm, so people end up getting problems with their visual fields.
Entering bloodstream.
Hey. So we see some red blood cells, and as we can see, they're traveling pretty fast. So this was my worry about if he's trying to go up the superior vena cava, because he'll be going against that blood flow and against gravity too. And at this point, we can probably estimate the size of Tuck based on the size of the pod next to the red blood cells. So I would say he's pretty much the size of a red blood cell, so about 7 micrometers, so 7 times 10 to the minus 6. So Tuck's been shrunk approximately 250,000 times smaller. That is a lovely shot of the optic nerve there going into the back of the eye. It's often said that when you look at the back of the eye, you're seeing part of the brain really, because the optic nerve is really an extension of the brain. He has changed his size a little bit there. I mean, before, as we say, he was kind of micrometers. Now he's probably more kind of millimeters in this shot. Can you see these tiny blood vessels at the back of the eye? Before we saw him traveling in a blood vessel like those red blood cells would have to do, but now he'd nowhere near getting them. But hey, we won't worry too much about that.
Firing optic sensor.
Cool. We see the optic sensor getting fired into the sclera, so the protective membrane around the eye, and then it's gone into the retina to try and read some of the light that's coming into the eye, which makes complete sense. Although the sclera doesn't have many pain nerves and the retina doesn't have any pain receptors at all. We know this because when people get diseases such as a detached retina, they can go get visual changes, even blindness instantly. And because it's painless, people often don't seek medical help, even though it's a medical emergency. In contrast, the front of the eye, the sclera, fuses to form this kind of windshield called the cornea, which has a huge amount of pain receptors and therefore one of the most sensitive areas of the body. So if you've ever had an abrasion on your cornea, you'll know what I mean.
I gotta talk to this guy.
Pathway to middle ear is as follows.
I'm not quite sure what part of the middle ear this is supposed to be. I'm guessing maybe this is the eustachian tube, so the tube that connects your throat to your middle ear, when the one that kind of pops when you're on a flight. Or maybe this is kind of a fluid-filled area, so part of the vestibular system or the cochlear system, how we balance and hear. But that would be more considered to be in the inner ear. So not quite sure here. Either way, the actual texture and colour and the sort of curves of the tissue look pretty realistic to me. So I'm guessing he's attached to the cochlear nerve, so the main nerve that takes the sound signals from your ear to the brain. And the theory behind this is pretty sound, if you excuse the pun, and it's pretty much how a cochlear implant would work. So that's a device that takes sound and turns it into electrical signals that directly stimulate the cochlear nerve. It does take time though for your brain to learn these electrical signals as sound. So you often see these miraculous videos on YouTube where someone hears for the first time. That's not how most people experience a cochlear implant. It can take sort of days to weeks to start interpreting things, and you won't ever hear exactly as you would if you had no hearing problems.
Here, inside you, inside your body.
Oh, God. Somebody help me! I'm possessed!
Jack, I think we can rule out demonic possession right off the bat.
But this little voice is talking to me.
See, that proves it. Demons talk through you, not to you.
So that's how demons work. A little bit of learning for anyone interested in the dark arts.
Approaching tricuspid valve of heart. Do not enter. Do not enter heart.
Back, baby.
Do not enter heart. Well, that kind of explains why he didn't go that route that we suggested before to go to the optic chiasm, but why not? I don't really see why there'd be an issue entering the heart itself. The chambers are just cavities, so they would just end up pumping Lieutenant Tuck out. So maybe it's because it's, you know, the pod's an electrical device and that could cause the heart to go into a funny rhythm, like a cardiac arrest rhythm. That could be one thing. And the other thing could be that, as we said earlier, it could get pumped to the lungs and get stuck in the lungs, causing a pulmonary embolism. And that is a lovely shot, unmistakably the tricuspid valve, so tri meaning 3 and cuspid meaning leaves, because as you can see here, the valve has 3 leaves. And to remind you, the tricuspid valve is the one that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle and stops blood going through in the wrong direction. And they've even timed it perfectly to the heartbeat. So, you know, your heartbeat sound, that lub-dub, 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 those sounds are actually the sounds of your valves closing. So the first sound, the lub of the lub-dub, lub-dub, would be the sound of the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve closing. And as if you look at the timings here, they've actually replicated it perfectly.
Got there, Jack.
Where have you been?
That's what I'm going to say every time I see a normal echo. That's one hell of a pump you've got there.
Well,
Mild hypothermia.
we made him alive.
I wouldn't trust that doctor diagnosing hypothermia from listening to the chest. That takes some skill. Hypothermia, as you probably know, would be diagnosed by core body temperature, because it's when you've got very low temperature. And does she say hyperthermia here?
Mild hypothermia.
That would be something very different, and it's probably the fault of medicine, actually, because hyper means high and hypo means low, which, you know, is really important to know what you're talking about and can often lead to conversations where the word goes back and forth until you can establish what they mean. Hang on a minute. What? Is this supposed to be a family film? What a beautiful shot of this fetus here. So clearly Tuck's found his way in the amniotic sac inside the uterus for this developing baby. So he's no longer in Jack. He's obviously been transferred when Lydia and Jack kiss. Quite how he got from kissing to in the amniotic fluid quite so quickly. It's a bit mad, but it's a sweet story. So we've got to let that one fly. And we see the developing fingers and toes, so the digits forming here. So this probably puts the fetus around about sort of 8 or 9 weeks. And this is very much what a fetus at this gestation would look like in terms of the dark eyes and this pinky, almost translucent skin. So the bad dude with the bullet finger and the vibrator hand ends up getting miniaturized as well to be injected into Jack to try and kill Tuck.
Mr. Iger will pilot the pod out through a tear duct or a sweat gland.
Why chance that? Once he takes over the pod and gets the chip, let's re-enlarge.
While it's still inside Mr. Putter?
Why not?
Have you any idea the kind of mess that would make?
You know what this theory of re-enlarging someone once they're in someone else reminds me of? That's right, Ant-Man and Thanos, or Thanos. If you haven't heard of it before, it's pretty much this, but involves Thanos' butt.
Tuck, help me. Make me strong.
Injection in the neck. We were doing so well to avoid this, but you know, we can't escape every cliche, can we?
Since you kissed me. Kiss me again.
So Tuck gets transferred back from Lydia to Jack via a kiss, and you may think, well, if Tuck's in the middle ear, how does he get into the throat so easily? And it's that eustachian tube we talked about before that connects you know, the middle ear to the throat. And we see an awful lot of saliva being transferred here, but you know, each to their own.
Object detected approaching through esophageal passage.
Cool. So the showdown between Bullet-Fingered Dude and Tuck happens, and it looks, you know, from the diagram and from the shape of the structure here, looks to be around about the epiglottis. So that's the kind of flap that protects your windpipes, so protects anything from going into the lungs when we swallow. So it's right by the windpipe and right by your food pipe. It adds a bit of peril because it wouldn't be the best place to part though, because we could get swept down into the lungs, and also if Jack swallows, we could end up going into the esophagus, the food pipe, and dissolved by the stomach acid at the bottom. Wow, again, a lovely shot of the anatomy here. So we've fallen through the lower esophageal sphincter. So that's the one that separates the esophagus to the stomach. So problems with that is why people often get acid reflux. And this is a lovely depiction of the stomach here. So we see its folds, its rugae here. The stomach's folded like that to increase its surface area and also to allow it to stretch when you've had a big meal. And we see down the bottom here the acid that's, you know, job is to, you know, kill lots of bacteria and viruses that have been in the food and found its way into the body.
Here's how I spell relief. Jack,
Wow.
good work.
I didn't expect the acid to work quite that quickly, but it's pretty nasty stuff, you know, pH of around about 3, I think, and we get a little cameo from Nina popping in at the end there, and they've digested the bad guy. So there you have it, my thoughts on this film. I thought it's absolutely brilliant, and they left it open to a sequel as well, which I would love to see another adventure in the human body, although, you know, some of these Hollywood remakes can be a bit dubious, can't they? So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please give it a like and consider subscribing if you haven't done already. Thank you so much for all your support on this channel. You know, it means so much to me. I really appreciate it. And so I hope you guys are well, and until next time, I'll see you soon.